And welcome to our week on ideology, party identification, and really polarization. That's where most of our focus is this week. So for today, we're going to be discussing party ID, which is short for party identification, and ideology, as well as elite polarization and polarization in the electorate. And when I say polarization in the electorate, I just mean polarization among people like us, not people who are in positions of power. Okay, so first off, let's talk about ideology. Really, ideology is a set of beliefs about the proper order of society and how it can be achieved. As your textbook describes it, conservatives tend to view society as sort of a control for humanity's worst impulses, and they tend to have the worldview that people are inherently unequal, and that results in unequal rewards, right, as you can see here. This worldview tends to result in conservatives wanting smaller government, except for a few specific issue areas like security and foreign policy. Conservatives also tend to be a bit more hawkish and ultimately tend to be more religious and moralistic as well. Liberals, by contrast, view the human condition as relative to the quality of society, and they tend to have more egalitarian worldviews. They tend to be more embracing of more expansive government, and they tend to have more cooperative attitudes when it comes to foreign affairs, i.e. not hawkish. They also see more benefits in government aid, and generally they're more permissive and less moralistic than conservatives, and also they tend to be not as religious. Now, as Converse noted, people with lower levels of political sophistication may identify themselves as liberal or conservative, but their policy preferences and issue positions may not match the ideology that they identify with. It's only people with higher levels of political sophistication who are going to have their ideology match their policy preferences. Now, of course, we associate conservatives with the Republican Party and liberals with the Democratic Party, but keep in mind that this wasn't always true. We used to have liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, especially conservative Democrats, also known as Dixiecrats. The primary differentiator of the two parties at mid-century at least was social welfare policy, and this is because of the New Deal. Democrats after FDR and during FDR are seen as being more generous in terms of social welfare policy. So people could tell which party was for Social Security and cash assistance in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and that was the Democrats. But on other issues, there wasn't necessarily that clear divide. There wasn't that clear difference between the two parties. It's only really in the 1960s that Democrats come out in favor of civil rights, and at the same time, Republicans are becoming more hawkish in terms of foreign policy in the 1960s. So by the 1980s, we're also seeing partisan divergence on social issues like abortion and gay rights, where conservatives are sort of emphasizing moralistic values. Be aware, though, these movements of conservatives towards the Republican Party and liberals toward the Democratic Party were driven by elites, and the masses really followed. If anything, party ID is considered a really, really stable identity that we all have, and we're unlikely to change it too much over the course of our lifetimes. But people will be much more willing to change their attitudes or their policy preferences to match their party ID than the other way around, where they change their party ID to match their issue positions. That latter option is far less likely. Ultimately, the idea is that supporters of a specific party are much more likely to change their policy preferences to follow their party's cues. Okay? And really, the parties themselves, the elites in those parties, are becoming more polarized. In American politics, we use these scores called nominate, or as you can see here, DW nominate scores, to measure how far apart the two parties are in the Senate and the House. We use roll call votes to measure this in a very, very fancy way in Euclidean space, so that we're examining, and keep in mind this is a really, really rough description of the methodology, but it's sort of this idea that Democrats are voting with Democrats and Republicans are voting with Republicans, and you're seeing how those two are moving apart. And examining this, there are two dimensions, typically for nominate scores. One is sort of the traditional liberal conservative dimension, and it's typically on economic matters. And the second dimension is, again, sort of a liberal conservative spectrum, but on issues of the day, things like civil rights or slavery. But typically we see most activity on that first dimension. We don't tend to look too much at the second dimension. We mostly look at that first one, that liberal conservative dimension, along economic issues. And we can look at nominate scores for the Senate, the House. We can look at it for individual members of Congress, even state legislatures and other political actors. In any case, what you're looking at here in this figure is the distance between the two parties and their nominate scores in the House, from 1949 to 1997. Higher scores along this y-axis mean there's more elite polarization between the two parties. So the higher up these points are, the more polarization there is between the two parties in the House. And even though we weren't really talking about polarization in the 90s, there was increasing polarization quite a bit in the 90s. We can see that it's declining from 1950s through the 1970s and really picks up again in the 1980s, which is about where we would expect. Now, this again examines polarization by party elites in the Senate. So the last one looked at the House, and this is the Senate. And again, we see a pretty similar trend. We see that polarization that we know today, right? There are different eras of polarization, but the polarization that we talk about today really picks up in the 1980s, right? We're seeing it pick up in the 1980s. And so you'll note that at the elite level, we're really seeing the Republican Party move further away from the Democratic Party. So yes, and so here is Republicans, and this maroon one here is Democrats. So from about 1980 on, yes, Democrats are moving further away, but Republicans are moving even further away. So yes, the Democratic Party is polarizing, but the Republican Party is polarizing a little bit more and moving further away than the Democratic Party is. In political science, we call this asymmetric polarization, where one party is moving further away than the other one. Now, the real question, both of these figures here, this one and this one, is about elite level polarization. So these are members of the House and the Senate. Does this elite level polarization affect the masses, right? Are the masses paying enough attention to elites to even know that they should be polarizing too? So here, the question is, can the masses see the differences? Can they? The answer is yes. Yes, they can. This is a figure from the Heathering piece you read for this week, and it's showing whether people identify differences between the two parties and how that has changed over time. In the 1960s and 1970s, about 45 to 55% of people identified that there are differences between the two parties. But starting in the 1980s and the 1990s, we're really seeing that north of 60% of people are identifying that there are differences between the two parties. In other words, the electorate is increasingly seeing that there are greater differences between the two parties. So does seeing differences really make people more partisan? More likely to be polarized themselves? Are we seeing the same polarization that we have at the elite level in the electorate? So I'm going to lay out a couple of cases here. In the one camp, what I would call Fiorina's camp, Mo Fiorina, is they argue that no, there is not polarization among the masses. Why? Look here at independents. And really, it looks like independents are a really strong identifier for most people. And from 2007 on, it looks like there's sort of growth of that in decline in identifying with the Democrats here and the Republicans here. So in any case, if we did have polarization in the electorate, then wouldn't we expect that there would be greater proportions of people who identify as Democrats or Republicans? Really, the polarization that we do see is concentrated among a small subset of highly informed and involved people. Okay? That's Fiorina's argument, at least. But let me walk you through Abramowitz and Saunders' arguments, which argue the opposite. Polarization does exist in the electorate. This table is the percentage of respondents with consistently liberal or conservative views across 7 issue questions. And this is really the percent of people who identify as liberal or conservative and express policy preferences that are consistent with their claimed ideology. And here we can see this table is from the Abramowitz and Saunders piece. We can see here that people have become more consistent over time with policy preferences and ideology. In this 1982 to 1990 time period, 24% of respondents had policy preferences that matched their ideology. But by 2004, that had increased to 33% of respondents. And the shifts are a bit more extreme the more tuned in you are. So look here, for those with high levels of knowledge, it shifts from 38% to 48% over the same time period. Those with high levels of interest, 34% to 45% have consistent policy preferences that match their stated ideology. Again, even you can see for college grads, 36% have consistent policy preferences with their ideology, and that grows to 49% in that same time period that we're examining. Abramowitz and Saunders also showed that there is a growing correlation between party ID and ideology. In other words, people are more likely to be conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats as time has gone on. Thus, it's less likely for there to be bridges between the two parties. Those conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, they're much, much less likely. So there's not really a nice bridge between the two parties anymore. And you can see that this correlation has gone up over time from around 0.3 in 1972 to 0.6 in 2004. There's just a much stronger association for people to have ideologies that are more consistent with their party IDs. They're also these are correlation coefficients, again from the Abramowitz and Saunders piece, between policy preferences and party ID. So values that are closer to 0, I don't know how familiar y'all are with correlation coefficients, but we do talk about it in lab. So values that are closer to 0 means there's not really an association between policy preferences and party ID, but values that are closer to -1 or 1 indicate that there is an association between the two. And looking at these over time, we can see that the correlation coefficients are growing and getting closer to 1. So in that 1972, 1980 time period, they're sort of hovering in the 0.2 range here and the 0.4 range here and the 0.26 range for the average. But look from the 1996 to 2004 time period, they're growing quite a bit. Right? They're growing quite a bit. The average increases 0.26 to 0.43. That means that there's a stronger association between policy preferences and party identification over this time period. It's growing. This means that people are developing policy preferences that are more and more consistent with their party ID, meaning, like the big point here is that people who identify as Democrats and Republicans are moving further and further apart on their policy preferences, okay? Fiorina also claims that, well, we haven't really seen any geographic polarization, and I will say we cannot stand by Fiorina's claim there. that is not a reasonable claim anymore. We know that red states are becoming redder and blue states are becoming bluer, and red counties are becoming redder and blue counties are becoming bluer. We're just seeing fewer and fewer purple places on the map, right? A lot of them are deep red or deep blue, and fewer purple places are existing. One, I suppose, pro of polarization in the electorate is that turnout increases as people become more polarized. In other words, as we all become more polarized, we become more interested in politics, which you can see here. This is from Abramowitz and Saunders again. It's percent of people who care who wins the presidential election and how that has changed over time. As people have polarized and become more interested in politics, you care more who wins, and you're just going to become more likely to participate in elections. And that was fairly evident with our most recent presidential election, right? Polarization in the electorate is quite high, and so was the turnout. But I've sort of given you the preliminary idea of what the fight in the literature is between Mo Fiorina on the one hand and then Abramowitz and Saunders on the other. And we'll talk about this a bit more in discussion section, but I hope this gives you a preliminary look at what we'll be examining and also sort of a brief summary of the Abramowitz and Saunders reading if you were having any trouble with it. So today we discussed party ID and ideology, also elite polarization. Yes, the elites are more polarized, and polarization in the electorate. We're probably also more polarized. But I will see you all in the discussion section.